From KQED Public Radio in San Francisco, I'm Michael Krasny.
My fellow Americans, we have endured a week such as no nation should live through, a time of violence and tragedy. I am tonight appointing a special advisory commission on civil disorders. Governor Kerner of Illinois has agreed to serve as chairman.
That was President Lyndon Johnson announcing his appointment of an 11-member committee to investigate the causes of the 1967 riots in Detroit and other U.S. cities. The Kerner Commission issued its landmark report on racism 50 years ago this month, and we'll talk about its legacy. Welcome to Forum. I'm Michael Krasny. 50 years ago, the Kerner Commission issued its landmark report on the causes of the 1967 race riots in Detroit, Newark, and other American cities. Convened by President Lyndon Baines Johnson and named for its chair, Illinois Governor Otto Kerner, the commission concluded that the nation was, quote, moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal, end quote. The report recommended far-reaching government action, including reforming the criminal justice system and eliminating all barriers to jobs, education, and housing. In this hour, we're going to discuss the Kerner Commission's legacy and impact. Joining us by phone is Fred Harris, former U.S. Senator from Oklahoma, the only surviving member of the 11-member Kerner Commission. Welcome, Senator Harris. Good to have you with us.
You bet. Thank you.
Glad to have you. And also glad to have John A. Powell, who's here with us in studio. He's director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society and professor of law, African American and ethnic studies at UC Berkeley. Welcome.
Thank you, Michael.
And Shaun Donovan, also here with us in studio, former director of the Office of Management and Budget between 2014 and 2017. He's also former U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development between 2009 and 2014. And welcome, Shaun Donovan.
Glad to be here.
Glad to have you, and also glad to have Sandra Susan Smith with us, professor of sociology and interim director of the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment at UC Berkeley. Welcome.
Thank you, Michael.
Glad to have you all aboard. And let me begin, Senator Harris, with you. This was a landmark by any standards report that was put out. And what it said, in effect, to many Americans, and it changed the whole conversation. We'll talk about what it was bringing in the way of change. But suddenly racism and prejudice and bigotry became really outed in many respects, didn't they?
That's true. That's true. I think we were the first government agency or organization that ever used the word racism. White racism, we said, is the basic cause for the creation of these black ghettos, and white racism sustains them. And then we, of course, recommended great new programs in regard to fighting racism and poverty.
But I guess the real mandate of the commission was to find the causes, but also to make rather substantive recommendations in terms of what could be done to ameliorate the problems, yes?
That's true. President Johnson gave us that charge, and he said, find the truth and express it in your report. And that's exactly what we did, but that shocked the conscience of the nation, I think, but it upset the president. He thought we'd gone too far, I think.
And this is the president who gave us the Civil Rights Bill, who fought it through and deserves a great deal of credit for that. But he was very, we'll get into the politics of this perhaps as we move along here, but he was certainly very enmeshed in Vietnam, and he had been suffering some defeats in the midterm elections. So there was a lot certainly on his mind, and I know that he didn't act on these. But some of these recommendations are recommendations that we need, one would argue, perhaps dramatically and desperately even today. Some of them are quite radical, in fact.
Well, I suppose that's true, but let me say first about Johnson. It is sad that he rejected this report because he did more against racism and against poverty than any president before or since. But President Johnson thought that there was some conspiracy behind these riots and violent protests. I talked to him personally about that and tried to dissuade him from it, but I never was able to do so.
Well, there were politics involved, as I said. I mean, President Nixon, who would later become president, was going up against him, and he was concerned about just how this was going to go over in the nation. But talk about what you were actually putting forward here. I mean, you were saying, in effect, that African Americans, black people, were not recognized as full human beings, really.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the case. We we went personally. Mayor Lindsay and I were a team. We divided up into teams.
That's John Lindsay, the former mayor of New York. Right.
Mayor of New York. He and I were a team and in the operation of the commission, too. But we went out to riot cities personally, as did other of the members of the commission. And he and I and the others already knew about these conditions, but we saw them really in stark reality and put faces on them. The wretched poverty, the racism that existed in these conditions and these cities where the riots and the violent protests had erupted, criminally inferior schools, no transportation to get to the jobs having disappeared or moved out to the suburbs or to other countries, and terrible housing. Conditions were just awful, and awful hostility between the people and the police with good reason. And that's what I tried to tell the president, that almost any spark could set off these violent protests, and that's exactly what did happen.
And there were certainly not only walks through different cities and what were then called ghettos, but also recognition of all kinds of people being called to testify. In fact, one of the ironies is Martin Luther King was called to testify, and so was J. Edgar Hoover, who was one of his main adversaries. Isn't that right?
That's right. We held 20 days of hearings, and we had witnesses all the way from Dr. King to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. And then we sent our staff people, too, all out around the country with interviews. And then we had 40 days straight of meetings in the Capitol in the room I organized, provided for. And we read aloud and voted on every single word in this report, and eventually adopted it by unanimous vote.
And you were talking about things that we're unfortunately still talking about. You were even talking about militarization of police and police brutality and things that really weren't a lot of part of the public discourse at the time. But as I said earlier, some recommendations that even by today's standards, things like universal jobs and universal health care, universal income even, pretty radical still.
Well, I suppose you could call them radical, but actually everything we recommend today is supported, the polls show, by a majority of Americans. The trouble is, I think a lot of people don't realize that these terrible problems are still with us and getting worse. We made progress on virtually every aspect of race and poverty for about a decade after the Kerner Report. Then that progress slowed, stopped, and reversed. And today, for example, racial and ethnic discrimination is worsening. We're resegregating the cities and the schools, condemning millions of kids to inferior schools where they're really locked into the poverty where they grew up. And in addition to that, there are millions more people who are poor now than there were 50 years ago. Poor people are poorer in more extreme poverty, harder to get out of poverty now. And the inequality of income is far worse now and is worsening.
Although the Kerner Commission report was pretty prescient on that, too, about inequality of income and inequality of justice and just inequalities in general based on race. Senator Harris, let me commend you for the work you've done on the committee and for serving the United States as U.S. Senator from Oklahoma between 64 and 73, the only surviving member of the 11-member Kerner Commission, Fred Harris. I said that John A. Powell is with us as well. He directs the Haas Institute for Fair and Inclusive Society and is professor of law, African American and ethnic studies at Berkeley, and actually put this conference together, which will be live tweeted at Haas Institute, and all kinds of extraordinary people and distinguished people involved in this. Let's go right to the heart of this, though, with you. Many people say what still is really at the heart of the Kerner Commission report is jobs, that jobs have everything to do with it, and inequality in jobs. But really housing, and this is kind of your bailiwick, when you think of housing, you also realize that housing is tied to, they're all tied together, but housing really has a great deal to do with job opportunities and the jobs that people can get, and it has to do also with the fact that so many things in people's lives are dictated by where they're living.
Well, that's right. And of course, there's no single way of sort of explaining what's going on. As you suggested, this is a system. But underlying it is a sense that there's certain people who don't belong. And in 1967, 68, we're talking largely in terms of African Americans or blacks, or as the report describes Negro. But today we're talking about still African Americans, blacks, Latinos, people with disabilities. So there's a sense that the country is for some people and not other people. And it's not just a sense in terms of an attitude, it's a sense in terms of policy. So, I mean, it's amazing that 50 years after the Kerner Commission, which was talking about how to build a society where all people belong, we're talking about not just prisons and still concentrated poverty or ghettos, but we're also talking about building walls. So there's a sense that and when you have that, then it shows up in housing, it shows up in education, it shows up in health, it shows up in all these things together, and they reinforce each other. So if you live in a neighborhood with bad schools, schools that are not adequate, you can't get a good job. If you can't get a good job, you can't accumulate wealth. You can't accumulate wealth. So all these things are related, but underlying all of it is the sense that there's certain people in the country who don't really belong, who we don't accord real concern. And we talk about this at the Haas Institute in terms of othering and belonging. And it's more complicated today because we do recognize it's not just two societies. We're talking about a fractured society where some people belong, the idea mainly whites, conservative whites, and other people don't really belong.
And as Senator Harris said, there's even more inequality. It's growing internationally, too.
The interesting thing is that up until about 1970, inequality in the United States was actually declining. From the end of World War II until the late 60s, because of government policies, because of the economy, inequality was actually declining. What's happened since then is that inequality, not just between blacks and whites, because to some extent that inequality is better or worse, but the elites. The economy has almost tripled in size since 1968, and almost all of those spoils have gone to a very small number of people, what Occupy call the 1%. But the people who get blamed for our economic stagnation are immigrants, blacks, other groups. So the situation is worse, and we don't have the clarity in terms of the costs. So now we actually blame the people who are still the victims rather than looking at where all the resources are going.
And I just want to say one other thing about housing, because that is something you've done a lot of work on, that housing discrimination, despite all the legislation we've had, still exists. It's more subtle, it's still severe, and frankly, it's still a great driver of inequality.
Well, that's certainly true, and I know Shaun's going to talk about this because he worked on it in terms of not just stopping discrimination, but affirmatively promoting what I call opportunity-based housing. And we are doing interesting stuff in California. So for all the bad news at the federal level, there's good news in states like New York, California. So there's reason to actually still have hope and still to work. And California is actually looking at some of these things very seriously.
Well, since we're talking about hope, Senator Harris, who has just a moment or two left with us, wanted to make a point about the positive outcomes. Senator Harris, go ahead.
Yes, I'm glad John Powell mentioned hope. And one of the reasons why I'm optimistic is there are people like those on this panel. And also there's more activism in the country right now than I've ever seen. With new organizations like the Women's March and Indivisible and Black Lives Matter. And lastly, there are people like Reverend William Barber of North Carolina who are leading a new poor people's campaign and the Moral Mondays movement, which is rapidly spreading. He's showing that you can put people together around common interests, whether they love each other or not. But if they get themselves together, he says, out of our silos where you've got labor on one side here and civil rights activists on the other, we ought to make our enemies, he says, fight us all at once, not one at a time. I think that's the way we've got to go, and I have some hope and optimism because of that.
On that optimistic note, I will say goodbye to you, Fred Harris. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, Fred Harris, last member living of the 11-member Kerner Commission, former senator of Oklahoma. Sandra Susan Smith is also with us, again, professor of sociology and interim director at the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment at UC Berkeley, who's been doing a great deal of work in a lot of the areas we've been discussing. But let's talk about criminal justice policy with you. I mean, what the Kerner Commission said in the way of recommendations was essentially ignored and maybe even reversed in many ways, yeah?
Absolutely. I mean, the Kerner Report focused a lot on policing issues, but generally speaking spoke to the kinds of changes that we needed to make with regards to education, housing, employment, and the welfare state. And the overarching message that I take from it, and that most of us take from it, is that we need to move away from policies and procedures that exclude and seclude and move towards policies that bring about a kind of inclusion of this population that had been historically denied access to good quality or high quality education, good jobs, safe and affordable housing, etc. And what we did instead was to invest in a massive construction of a penal state that focused its attention and ire on the very people who were protesting to make change in order to gain access to the resources that mainstream Americans had taken for granted. So we invested a great deal in hiring more police officers. We invested a great deal of federal, state, and local resources in building jails and prisons. And then we sought to fill those cells with young Black and Latino men primarily, and people who are poor regardless of race and ethnicity. So in the U.S., then we went from a place where we had incarcerated about 100 people per 100,000 up until about 1970, and by the time we reached the mid 1990s, we were up towards about 700 people per 100,000, one of the highest rates of incarceration in the world. If we were to break this down by race, what we see is that about 300 whites per 100,000 have been incarcerated, but about 2,000 Blacks per 100,000 have been incarcerated. If we focus on Black men who are young and without a high school diploma, where the figures are up to about 4,000 per 100,000. So we focused our attention and targeted the very people who were in need of the investments with regards to education, with regards to opportunities for employment, with regards to opportunities for better and safe, affordable housing.
Which were the recommendations of the Kerner Commission.
Exactly. So we did the exact opposite of what the Kerner Commission recommended. And in the process, we actually reproduced racial inequality. We didn't end it, nor do I think we made, at least for the populations we're talking about, substantial progress. By incarcerating these folks, we then make it even more difficult for them to get jobs. And when they do get jobs, they work fewer weeks per month. They bring home smaller paychecks. They also are now have to fight or deal with the burden of incredible debt that's associated with criminal justice fines and fees. When you don't make very much money, having debt associated with a criminal justice contact doesn't make life easy. And so it produces a set of outcomes that actually creates a greater gap across the races in terms of the outcomes that we care about. And this is not even mentioning the kind of poor health and poor health that people experience, the loss of voting rights, et cetera. And we should also say that as a result of these kinds of experiences, what happens is that people then end up trying to avoid mainstream institutions. There's a kind of institutional avoidance that happens when you have so much negative contact with the government, especially in the form of the criminal justice system. So people try to stay off the radar. So instead of inclusion, what we're actually doing is producing not just exclusion and seclusion. We're incentivizing individuals to remove themselves from the mainstream.
They make me think almost reflexively of Michelle Alexander's excellent work in this whole area that you're discussing here. Again, Sandra Susan Smith with us in studio is Professor of Sociology and Interim Director of the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment at UC Berkeley. Let's talk to Shaun Donovan before we bring you, our listeners, into this. He's former Director of OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, and also former U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. So we get back to housing again, but we also want to just look, Shaun, at, the legacy of the Kerner Commission. That's really what our major issue is here, or a major charge and challenge. And from your perspective, again, we just didn't follow through, right?
Unfortunately, that's true. And I think it's particularly important to have this conversation in an age where the President of the United States is actively proposing to take us backwards in many of these areas. One of the most remarkable things to me about the Commission, and I tip my hat to Senator Harris for the work that was done there, think about the fact that this was a group. The elected officials were evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. They came from states as broadly representative of the country as Oklahoma, Kentucky, New York, California, Ohio. And so
also, as you were intimating, talking about President Trump, they had their directive from the President of the United States.
Exactly right. This was not speaking truth to power. This was speaking truth from power. And that, I think, is what is such a landmark about this. It was not only speaking so forthrightly the unvarnished truth about our history, but it was doing it in a way that really brought a very diverse group from around the country together with unanimous approval of those recommendations. So I do think it's remarkable. I would also say that one of the things that is particularly important about it is that where the commission could have taken a sort of narrow view of what President Johnson was asking them to do. In other words, to diagnose the very direct cause of the riots. They took a much broader view of his three questions that they asked him and produced what I think is probably the most comprehensive prescription in a very, very broad range of areas. We've talked a little bit about housing. We've talked about criminal justice, but there were employment, safety net, a very, very broad range of proposals. And I think particularly at a time where, and I say this as a former federal budget director, where recent events like the tax bill passing, the dramatic cuts to federal agencies that are responsible for all of these areas the Kerner Commission talked about, it would be next to impossible to put in place even a small share of those recommendations, given the constraints that this president and the Republican Congress continue to put on our ability to direct resources to the problems that the Kerner Commission.
Well, there was a $2 billion 5-year pilot program which was supposed to address systemic poverty under the Obama administration.
I would argue that there were many different ways that we took on and tried to move forward on what the Kerner Commission did. Criminal justice is a good example of that. Not only did the president, I think, take moral leadership, President Obama, by being the first sitting president ever to visit a federal penitentiary, but we put in place a broad range of efforts, both at the federal level. We convened state and local police chiefs and others, and we saw for the first time a sustained drop both in crime and in our prison population. And I think we were moving in the right direction, and I now worry that President Trump is going to take us backward in that area. That's just one example of the type of efforts that we did under the Obama.
This is Forum. I'm Michael Krasny. We're talking about the Kerner Report, which was released 50 years ago, and it was a report that had an electrifying effect and certainly changed the public discourse because for the first time it was talking about America being two nations and talking about the reality of racism and what needed to be done and what really had to be done to keep the country from being totally polarized racially. And the problem still persists. The conference will be tweeted, live tweeted. I want to mention that again. And the conference also will be at the Haas Institute. The head of the conference, John Paul, is with us, and he's director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, also professor of law and African American and ethnic studies at UC Berkeley. And we have with us in studio Shaun Donovan, who's former director of the Office of Management and Budget and also former U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and Sandra Susan Smith, who's professor of sociology and interim director of the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment at UC Berkeley. We do want to hear from you, our listeners. I'm old enough to remember this report, and I can tell you that it did have an amazing impact and a dramatic impact because suddenly it was as if, I said earlier, it was as if things were outed about what many had all certainly realized about just how troubling and how deep and profound problems of racial inequality were and other kinds of inequality in our country, institutional inequality. Let me go to some callers, and let's begin with John. John, you're on the air.
Oh, hi. I just wanted to ask your guest, Mr. Sullivan, about George Romney and Richard Nixon when George Romney attempted to enforce the Fair Housing Act. He did so maybe a little more aggressively than Nixon wanted, and maybe your guest can comment on that.
You said Mr. Sullivan. I think it's Mr. Donovan, Shaun Donovan. Yeah, well, Romney was head of HUD, and maybe we should bring that whole thing into focus here about his role and Nixon's role in all this.
It's a very interesting piece of history, but maybe just to step back directly to the Kerner Commission report, their very first recommendation on housing was to pass what they called an open housing law. And in fact, 5 weeks to the day after the report was issued, Martin Luther King was gunned down. A week later, President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act. And while the primary focus of the Fair Housing Act was to attack the extensive discrimination against blacks and other minorities in housing around the country, it also had a relatively short section that required that communities affirmatively further fair housing. It wasn't that clear about what exactly that meant. But Secretary Romney, under Nixon, was actually the first HUD secretary to be required to implement the Fair Housing Act, and he took relatively seriously this requirement to affirmatively further fair housing, pushing communities around the country not just to stop discriminating, but to take active measures to promote integrated communities. And the story goes that as a reward for trying to do that, President Nixon offered him the ambassadorship of Mexico. And that was how Secretary Romney ended up losing his job.
Well, it also prompts me to ask a question of John Powell, who was a co-author of an excellent report that was put out with the Center of Housing Studies at Harvard with a your co-author's name, Hardwell, or what was her name again? I'm going blank on it.
So am I.
Selma Hardwell, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. But I was going to ask you, because you write about the Fair Housing Act in the report and say essentially there were still racial covenants, there was still all kinds of, realtors discriminating, banks discriminating on loans. I mean, it just really couldn't be implemented.
Yeah, the Fair Housing Act in its first iteration was actually a compromise, so it wasn't designed to do everything. It was designed to create all these exceptions. That was it was strengthened in 1988, and new categories were added. But also, it's important to sort of realize that HUD has a very important role in terms of execution. It's not self-executing. And what Romney was trying to do was basically open up the suburbs. He was saying we can't have a healthy society, integrated society, where at that time blacks and other people of color were largely consigned to urbanized areas where opportunity was fleeing. So jobs were leaving. I grew up in Detroit. There wasn't a new factory built in Detroit for almost 20 years. They were all going to the suburbs, and blacks were left in the city. And Romney, who had been a president of American Motors and was from Michigan, he knew that this was happening. He was saying, you can't address this unless you deal with the suburbs. Today, we still have the problem of not having really integrated housing. The housing market still remains heavily segregated. As I said earlier, California is trying to do something moving in the right direction. And part of that means changing the structure of how we build housing. We can't let each community, each city, decide which housing it's going to build. Because no one then wants to build affordable or low-income housing. Romney understood that. And even in liberal California, there's a fight as to, can we say we have to build housing for everybody?
Well, that was the big fear factor of the Kerner Commission report, because the word integration was used frequently in that. And a lot of people, particularly in the South, but here in California, everywhere, white people recoiled.
That's right. And it's sort of interesting using the word white racism in the Kerner Commission report in 1968. But the year before, in 1967, the United States Supreme Court decided a case called Loving. And they talked about white supremacy. And, for a listener who wasn't alive back then, we had 17 states that outlawed the marriage of whites with non-whites. So it wasn't subtle. But today, we don't have the clarity that we had in the Kerner Commission report. Politicians are afraid to talk about racism, especially afraid to talk about white racism. And the last thing I'll say is that the criminal justice system was not about crime. It was about actually locking away John Ehrlichman, part of Nixon's cabinet. He basically talked about how do you actually attack the two enemies of Nixon, which were blacks and hippies. These were his own words. And he said, we can't just lock up blacks and hippies, but we can have a drug policy that actually allows us to do just that.
I want to go back to more callers here, but let me bring Sandra Susan Smith back into this. And I'm just wondering, we were talking about criminal justice with you and incarceration, and As a sociologist and as someone who's done a lot of work in this area, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the fact that we still have a crisis in this country with unarmed young black teenagers essentially being gunned down, with segregation, police brutality issues, but also the rise of white nationalist movements, which could hardly have been predicted at one time, even maybe during the Kerner Commission years or right after that, and protests over monuments and buildings. I mean, we've come into all kinds of different spheres here that sometimes go back and sometimes move us slightly forward and sometimes make us think we're back where we started from.
Mm-hmm. And so was there a question there?
Yeah, the question is how you respond as a sociologist, to that reality that I'm trying to paint here. In fact, I'm even looking at, let me bring it into a question from Noel, one of our listeners, who said, if we can't agree about the effects of the legacy of slavery, how can we have a more equitable society?
These are good questions. I think we could start from a place where we look at communities where things are run in a way that we like to see, where children grow up healthy and happy and are fairly successful. What are the characteristics of communities like that, right? And that's not very difficult to imagine. These are communities where the adults are in jobs that pay fairly well or pay a living wage. You have schools that are fairly high quality. You have safe and affordable housing. You have all of the kind of institutions and organizations that contribute to a healthy community, right? How do we get to that place? We get to that place through investments. And oftentimes those investments are what happens when government contributes, when business contributes, and when you have solid support for workers or laborers. We know that communities can thrive in circumstances like that. What we fail to do is to provide those same kinds of resources to communities of color, especially when they're low income. We've actually forsaken them in many ways across generations. And so in some ways, I don't think, I'm actually reminded of what Michael Harrington wrote in
The Other America.
The Other America. Yeah. We know the solutions to these problems. And this was 1959, 1962, somewhere around there. We know the solutions to the problems. The issue is that we don't often have the political will to move in this direction. We seek to devote resources to some groups and to some causes, and we systematically and historically ignore or diminish the relevance of issues that are faced by other groups and other problems.
Since you mentioned Harrington, though, I can't help thinking about the fear that's attached to. He was a socialist, in fact. So it's integration is one of those words that creates fear, and socialism maybe even to a greater
After
extent.
Bernie, we're all social democrats now, right?
The conference, by the way, I want to give this information, will be tweeted from the Haas Institute, and there is still space if you'd like to register. It runs from today until Thursday afternoon. We have a link up about the conference on our website. It's the website again, kqed.org/forum. And here's another caller, and it's from Sacramento. Aaron, you're on the air. Good morning.
Oh, hi, Michael. I enjoy your show. Thank you for all that you do. I also just wanted to thank you for allowing us to hear the voice of Senator Harris on the phone, and I wanted to highlight, in addition to his contributions in the Kerner Commission report, which it's so great to be hearing this, especially right now. His 1976 run for president and his leadership as a senator inspired a whole generation of us in politics and people-oriented politics and people-oriented populist values. And now in this age of pseudo-populism with Trump, I think it's important to hear from Senator Harris. I hope you have him back to talk about that and some of the contributions of his career and leadership.
We'd love to have him back. Thank you.
Which the Kerner Commission report is just one part of it. So I just wanted to thank you and thank Senator Harris for his leadership all these years and for what he gave to many of us in the country.
Well, thank you. Kind of you, and appreciate hearing from you. That's Aaron from Sacramento. And here is another caller, Wynn from Menlo Park. Good morning.
Thank you. 50 years ago, when the Kerner Report came out, the country was balanced. We had government, we had military, we had labor, and we had business, all pretty much balanced so that we could build the kind of systems and country that we wanted. Now we have done a good job of destroying the unions. And as a Professor Krebs of the business school that I listened to for a couple of years said, if we lose one of those four legs of the stool, the country is going to be out of balance. And I think he has been 100% right now, because we have a different balance than we had when the Kerner Report came out.
All right, Win, thank you for your comments. And here's a comment from a listener named Pendarvis. I don't know if any of our panelists can provide the answer. Pendarvis wants to know, how do you get the information from the Kerner Report into the hands of high school and college students? It makes no sense that this information wasn't mentioned in any of my American history classes.
Well, I think that's a great question. The one thing, the Kerner Commission was a bestseller. So now you might think of it as an academic or political wonkiness, but it sold, I think, sold over 3 million copies.
Amazing success on them. Yeah.
So I think for teachers, for all of us in our curriculum, not
like the book about Trump, and the
right. California has actually talked about including in our history books in California the Russian involvement in the election. So it would also be useful to sort of think about the Kerner Commission, because people might not know that term Kerner Commission, but the substance of it is really critical for our history. And as Shaun said, to have a government entity essentially put this report out is extremely important, especially in a time where part of the ethos is don't trust government. Government can do and should do something and should be accountable to the people. So I hope that we actually do get Kerner Commission into the high schools.
Wasn't the Kerner Commission also saying, Shaun Donovan, in effect, that that there's the word is often used now, privilege in being white that people of color don't have?
Absolutely. And I think this was, when I said earlier, the unvarnished truth that the report gave to the country was to really root the growth of the ghetto, as they called it, in the much broader arc of history of discrimination, and said that white society had created it and sustained it. And I think, one of the things, we've talked a lot about the policy pieces of the Kerner Commission report. There was also a very personal call that the commission made to each American to look at themselves, to look at their own attitudes, to look at their actions, and to develop the personal will. And I think particularly at a time where social media and other forces in our country tend to divide us, they were asking white Americans like me to understand that history and to be able to sort of step out of their own personal lives and put themselves into the lives of a group that had been discriminated against throughout the history of the country. And that, I think, that personal call is something, when you talk about teaching young people about the report, that personal call is something that is really important today.
Here's Charles, who writes regarding racial equality. I feel like we've made a giant leap backwards. It's going to be a bear to recover from the past year. What about the argument, though, let me go to you on this, Professor Smith, that you often hear we've had civil rights legislation. Again, as we said earlier, President Johnson was really in the forefront of this. We have statutes. We have, a lot of movement forward, certainly since that time. I mean, it can't be denied.
No, it can't be, and I don't think it should be. But I think that we need to be careful about how much we need to be careful to not overstate what we've done. So if we look at, I'm going to go back to the criminal justice system in part because I think it plays a huge role not only in reproducing inequality, but also obscuring the extent to which we still have major gaps in inequality. So if we were to take into consideration the closing gaps between blacks and whites in income over the past 2 generations, what we'd see is a remarkable decline, right? Partly you see that decline because we don't include in our statistics the people that we warehouse in jails and prisons. A disproportionate number of whom are Black and Latino. If we were to include those folks who are at the low end of the income bracket or have no income at all, it turns out that Blacks haven't done anywhere near as well as we thought they did, and we can explain away the bulk of the progress that we thought we've made by pointing to the fact that we have incarcerated so many people who are at the low end. So those
who are warehoused don't get
They don't count. They don't get counted in the statistics because institutionalized populations don't, right? So it makes it look like we've made way more progress than we have made. And so these are things I think we need to take into consideration.
Forgive me, but what about when President Trump says, I've made more progress than anybody has with
President Trump says a lot of things that we should probably not pay much attention to. But yeah. And I would actually like to speak to the caller from before who asked about how we could get the Kerner Report and the Kerner Report into the hands of high school students, college students, et cetera, and why we haven't done that. I mean, in this country, I think we still struggle to even talk about the institution of slavery. Right? And this is a long-standing. We understand how slavery started. We understand the role that it played in terms of developing the economy. We understand the role that it played in terms of creating a social structure, a racial hierarchy. And still, with that, we have a hard time in this country talking about it because it makes plain the role that white racism and institutional racism plays in the perpetuation of an exploited class. I think that partly it's difficult to talk about what comes out of the Kerner Report because it here again makes plain the role that white racism and institutional racism play in keeping citizens of this or residents of this country on the bottom. It's not just an easy an even playing field. There are structures in place that make it difficult for many people to get ahead, and this is part of the problem.
And let me go to another call and remind you can join us at 866-733-6786 or by email, forum@kqed.org. Here's OV from Oakland. Good morning.
Oh, hello. Thanks for taking my call, Michael. I wanted to kind of get to some basics around the conversation. We live in a capitalistic system. That's our economic system. It influences the social system, the political system, so on and so forth. But that hasn't been mentioned. Capitalism was based on racism, slavery, and genocide, and it still needs racism to function. So it needs to warehouse people, especially black people, because there are no jobs created by the capitalistic system. Those jobs are being exported. Globalization. There's a whole redundant population of people that are not going to be included in the system because the system does not need them. Capitalism is moving to Asia, in case you haven't noticed. It doesn't need America anymore. It's disinvesting in America. So all this talk about investment doesn't make any sense without talking about the economic system, which is disinvesting in America and not producing any jobs because they're shipping them to these low-cost countries. So let's talk about what stage of capitalism we're in.
No, OV, you've raised the point, and we've mentioned the S word, socialism. We might as well talk about the C word here, capitalism. Anybody on the panel want to jump in on this and talk about the culpability of the capitalist system here and how much it plays its preeminent or significant role?
Well, I'll say a little bit. I mean, capitalism, first of all, capitalism or the markets is actually, there are many different markets. It's not one. So I don't want a defender of capitalism, but
John Powell, by the way.
There are capitalist countries all across the world. They don't have the inequality that we have. They don't have the incarceration rate that we have. We have a higher incarceration rate than almost any country in the world. We only have to look at our sister country just north of us. It's a capitalist country. Their incarceration rate is like, I think, 1/10 of ours. Not only that, while you're in prison in Canada, you still maintain the right to vote. They believe that it's important to hold on to your citizenship even while you're in incarceration. So they have less inequality. They have a higher standard of living. It's still a capitalist country. So it's not saying they're perfect by any means. They don't have the kind of police shootings that we do. So I think even within the context of what we call capitalism, again, those are many different systems, we could do a lot better. Yes, the racism, especially in the United States, capitalism grew up on racism and slavery. But I worry if we say the only way we can fix this is to overturn capitalism, because that's such a heavy lift. We could do a lot more. We were doing better in the 1960s under Johnson. Capitalist society still. Inequality was shrinking. And prison rates weren't what they are today. So we can't explain everything that's happening just by capitalism. Racism has an independent trajectory in the United States that actually interacts with capitalism, and we can do better.
Let me ask you, John Powell, if I may, talking about where the blame lies and all that, and the reaction to the Kerner Commission report and everything. Otis Taylor, who writes for the local paper, had an article about this Kerner Commission conference that you're having in the Kerner Commission and so forth, just in yesterday's local paper. And he brought up William Greer and Price Cobbs, and that seemed to be a reaction to the Kerner Commission report, too. That is, they wrote a book. They were two black psychiatrists here in San Francisco, wrote a book called Black Rage. And there was a lot of anger in the black community because the Kerner Commission and its studies went not only to the white community as a bestseller, but black people and people of color were buying this in paperback as well.
No, it's actually the narrative and how people understand themselves is very important. And in the middle of the 60s, a lot of people don't realize this. There was not only Dr. King, there was also Malcolm X, there was also Stokely Carmichael. There was a split in the black community. And you see that split reflected in the new movie, The Black Panther. How do you see that split reflected in Puerto Rico? So when you have a oppressive society, do you trust it or not trust it? And it's actually more complicated than that. There are people of good intentions of all different races and ethnicities, and the people who will exploit, and the people who will strategically use. So there's not a simple answer. But again, I grew up in the middle of that in the 60s in Detroit, and there was a serious split. And there was black rage. But King also talked about a beloved community who had a huge impact, not just on Johnson, but on the country. So I think these are serious discussions. And what's happening is not just a distribution of wealth, but a distribution of identity. We're actually making new people, new society. In California, we're about to get to a place now where most new families formed in California will actually be multiracial families or multi-ethnic families. That's amazing, given that Loving happened 50 years ago, 51 years ago. And people are going to be hurt, going to be angry, but people also need to reach out and bridge. And part of the thing, we need a crucible to have this discussion in a deliberate, ongoing, sustained way. We don't have that now. Instead, what we have is the most vitriolic rage is coming from white nationalists. That's new, and that's actually coming from the White House itself. So this is a dangerous space, not just in the United States, but all around the world.
Well, let me go back to you, to either Shaun Donovan or Sandra Susan Smith, whoever wants to take this question. But why, in the judgment of either of you, did the Kerner Report Commission's recommendations simply fall? We've talked about the politics, but putting that aside, I mean, was there resistance in the country to it? I mean, it would seem to be at least a significant factor.
Well, I would say it is not that different from the reason why we aren't paying more attention to these issues today. If you live in a community where you don't see these issues every day, if you don't have an experience of reading this history, then it's not influencing the way you vote. It's not influencing the conversations you have with your neighbors. And that's one of the most pernicious things about the segregation that continues to drive our communities and our country. Not only does it cut people off from opportunity, but it cuts people off from the very conversations that allow them perhaps to bridge these gaps. And that's where, I would argue that President Obama did a lot to try to bridge those differences. President Trump is doing the opposite. He is stoking those differences. And given the changes in the way we communicate, the ability to only be on social media with people who have the same interests or like you, we are compounding in some ways those very differences that allow people to ignore the history that the Kerner Commission talked about. And so I do think that in this age of fragmented communications and tribalism, I would say, we have to take on as a country how to overcome that, and that would help us get to challenging some of these problems.
Let me read a comment from William, who says, what would they call the commission that addresses the two societies in Trump's America, the wealthy and corporations and everyone else? Well, that was the Occupy movement, I guess, when we think about it. We got seconds left here. What would be, let me go back to you, Professor Smith, what would be top priority now in light of where we are compared to where we were then?
Top priority. What we know to be true is that for the opportunities for mobility that we hope that most children in this country, or all children in this country have, there's a way in which our futures are set by the time we're in third grade. And we know that a lot of what happens up until that period in their neighborhoods, in their communities, in their families, contributes to providing the foundation that they need in order to thrive and survive. This is true of Black families, Latino families, white families, across the board, and across class status. To the extent that we fail to invest in infrastructures that provide support around fair and affordable housing, around access to good jobs for the parents of these children, around housing, etc.
It's all related.
It's all related.
We will
continue. In 50 years, we will be having this conversation again.
From your lips to whomever's ears is listening up there in the divine celestial sphere. Thank you all. Thank you, John Powell, Shaun Donovan, Sandra Susan Smith, and thank you, Fred Harris. For all of us at KQED Public Radio, I'm Michael Krasny.